Okay, I think everyone. Okay, everybody. I think everyone can hear me. What I am saying. So if you have any complaints, you can actually ask me. So we will continue from chapter 7, where we left. If you have any problems regarding to, or if you have any questions, you can use this chat room ability. I guess I'm not very professional on this one either, but we will try to learn. So if we continue from chapter 7, I think we left on the transition to product innovation and just in time, no inventory stock, no inventory production style in Toyota and Japanese flexible production systems. So since late 1970s, this just-in-time production became a norm without too much inventories. That means a lot of times these companies, car companies and computer companies, for example, started to use this option as a production. For example, most of the time, what they actually try to do is to customize the products. And most of the time, when they individualize these products, they actually oriented the production towards the different tastes of consumers. And a lot of times what we see in international production systems is every time a demand occurs, for example, these factories started to produce according to the demand of different individuals. So individual taste and individual demand since late 1970s became some kind of a norm of the, or important part of this production process in international economy. So as I said last week, where we left from, if you remember, the Toyota Japanese corporation was the actual forefather or pioneer of this just-in-time production system. And And they also take this flexible production. What is this flexible production? Generally, most of the time, this flexible production in international economy is, for example, they change the labor conditions. For example, how much time you work at a certain week or a certain day. And also, for example, they can change the day and night schedules and how much time they can demand from the workers. Rather than, for example, 8-hour day work week that people used to in the 1970s, this 1980s flexible production styles generally oriented towards these flexible time schedules. So, for example, this was also discussed and disputed a lot of times in international political economy. For example, whether this flexible production system and flexible work hours are good for the working class or for workers, or is it some kind of a, for example, another imposition? For example, when you choose to work from your home in a flexible style, or during nights or weekends, for example, is it some kind of an actually violation of the privacy of the workers themselves, or is it some kind of an enlargement of the authority of the management towards the, for example, homes or private life spaces of the workers? So these flexible production systems and also the guarantees of the workers, for example, in terms of living standards, their lifetime guarantees from trade unions or other previous bargains before 1970s also started to be decreased or reduced. So living standards during this flexible production times, especially for ordinary blue-collar workers, also decreased. White-collar people who are actually working with their brain labor, it depends on their conditions, but for most of the blue-collar workers, this flexible production systems can create, for example, a lot of problems in terms of living standards for the working class people. So if we go from there, after this, what we can say is Africa and African continent's situation. Africa left behind in foreign direct investment, for example, especially after the 1970s and starting from 1980s. Why Africa was left behind compared to the other countries? For example, the issue is most of the African countries, nearly independent countries, they get their, for example, foreign credits or foreign investments either from the Western capitalist system or as an alternative from the socialist bloc. But with the late 1970s, when the Soviet Union and during the Cold War, when the Eastern Bloc or Communist Bloc, in other words, when they got weakened in terms of bargaining position or geopolitical power against the Western alliance, you can say Africa doesn't have any alternatives, or they didn't have any remaining alternative against the Western financial institutions, for example, to borrow these loans. So most of the time, Africa, because it has a lot of associated underdevelopment problems, so these African countries, when these Western corporations try to choose new places for direct investment. For example, they tended to choose China and Southeast Asia because the infrastructure and investment conditions and the education of the workers, for example, readiness of the government bureaucracy, incentives for production, large-scale customer markets, all of these kind of issues generally impacted or influenced these decisions of the multinational corporations. So Africa generally left behind in this foreign direct investment issues. So most of the African stock exchange markets, since they are also comparatively weaker compared to the Western corporations or Western financial institutions, you can say hot money, or what we call hot money, these portfolio investments to Africa were also very little compared to other parts of the world. So you can say underdeveloped world or the least developed part of the world, they were generally in a disadvantageous position in this competition for foreign direct investments since 1980s. So what other options for these multinational corporations? For example, joint ventures with local partners increased these foreign corporations or transnational corporations. They also, for example, increased their joint venture investments with local partners. What they mean by these local partnerships, for example, let's say you are a McDonald's or Burger King as some kind of a transnational corporation, or like ExxonMobil. When you, for example, decided to make investment in Turkey, in Brazil, or in India, you generally choose local firms who actually works in the same sector. And after choosing these partners, for example, when you create these joint partnerships with the local companies, they generally know the local bureaucracy and local conditions and local markets better than these multinational corporations or foreign investors. So they somewhat help the people or these transnational corporations and make it much more convenient. Also, a lot of times, for example, for foreign direct investment, there can be sometimes what they called reactions from local politicians or reactions from nationalistic elites against these foreign direct investments. And in 1980s, increasingly what we see is these local partnerships or joint ventures greatly facilitate or eased this process of transition. Because otherwise, for example, those anti-Western reactions or anti-foreign reactions from nationalistic groups in third world countries can create a lot of political problems for multinational corporations. And when they sell and buy in these markets, they wouldn't be that comfortable. So this joint venture or local partnerships generally can ease these transition processes. Another issue is licensing in international economy. For example, most of the time you can see these licensing and franchising the name of the corporation to a local chapter or local partner. For example, instead of directly investing anything in your country, a lot of times, for example, McDonald's or Burger King do this franchising, or they prefer these kind of licensing and franchising processes, they rent their name. And when you pay some money, this franchising or licensing, some kind of an actually a fee to these transnational corporations, some kind of a transnational tax to these corporations, then you can get the name, use of the brand name in your own country. So this is a franchising. So through this franchising, you can, for example, use that multinational company's brand name in your products. So this is another kind of investment model when we transit or when we get into this transnational production in the 1980s. What we can further say about this is shifting global and local demand. So a lot of times when these transnational corporations and their local partners in their production what we can say is a lot of times they actually can mix this global and local demand conditions. What is this global and local demand conditions? For example, sometimes some of these demands from a certain population around the world can increase or create a global demand for a certain product. Especially, for example, in today's social media environment, you can figure it out, or you can maybe familiar to those processes. For example, in the 1980s, people started to buy, for example, famous basketball or football players' apparel. For example, that became some kind of an important marketing style. So something local can immediately turn into, through the media and through movies, especially in the 1980s before the internet, can become a global source of demand. So these demands and production shifted from local to global. It is much more volatile. So if we look at the foreign direct investment and if we evaluate the foreign direct investment model in terms of it is economic, cultural, and political results since 1980s in every walks of social life, in also in and around our societies, you can see immediate results or some consequences in different areas of this foreign direct investment. For example, some governments used to force foreign direct investment to certain sectors, some kind of a mandate. So this was especially nationalistic and much more authoritarian governments tended to choose this option. For example, in order to somewhat create a parallel between the needs of the government or between the needs of that society and these foreign multinational corporations, some governments used to force these foreign corporations to certain sectors so that they can pretty much try to align their production with the societal needs in that way. But if you accept this free market and free trade idea in the 1980s and under democratic conditions, if you are, for example, a democratically elected government who has a lot of respect to the free trade and free market conditions and the property rights, then a lot of times you cannot use this enforcement of FDI. For example, some countries choose to open free trade zones, especially in coastal areas across the world. For example, Chinese Shanghai region. These coastal areas, because they are very close to the ports, when you create these free trade zones, they became, for example, some kind of an autonomous region or autonomous area that you may actually have production incentives, tax incentives, and much more flexible environment and labor regulations in these free trade zones. So a lot of times these trade zones are much more flexible and free from government regulations. So since bureaucracy is less cumbersome or less encroaching towards the property rights or the working conditions of these corporations, you can say they tended to choose to go these free trade zones because export and import from and outside these, from and towards these free trade zones are much more convenient and easier. One of the significant issues we can actually talk about these foreign direct investment is the question of technology transfer. For example, what about the technology transfer of these corporations? A lot of times people and scholars and also activists who think about this or who discuss these issues of foreign direct investment, especially benefits and detriments of FDIs, this technology transfer became another important issue. What is a technology transfer for corporations? For example, when Apple or another technology company, let's say if they came to your country and make investments, and how they actually bring technology, new production technology to your country is very important for most countries. For example, China is very keen or sensitive about this transferring technology from Western corporations. But at the same time, a lot of Western governments and the Western corporations, they weren't that positive about bringing this new technology and new technology licensing to these third world countries or developing countries. Why? Because another issue is if you give this technology to these third world or underdeveloped countries, then they may use it. Like the Chinese example today, for example, they create this Huawei as a competitor to Apple and other telecom companies in the United States. For example, they can produce an alternative technologies and alternative production lines or competitive models against your companies. So sometimes in the pharmaceutical industry, also this is a very interesting argument because in the pharmaceutical industry, generic drugs and licensed drugs especially during the, for example, times like these, how to use these foreign drugs without patent rights or copyrights can be very crucial issues. And technology transfer is also very influential in these kind of disputes. For example, whether these drug companies can, for example, let the locals to produce, for example, generic or replicate drugs without any copyright violations. For example, that can be a lot of times create controversies between these transnational corporations and national governments. If we continue to ask these kind of questions in terms of evaluating the benefits and detriments of these foreign direct investments, where activities of high value addition occurred. This is another important question that you have to think about when you think about and when you discuss these kind of issues of transnational production. High value addition, for example, a lot of times high-tech products, cars, computers, or plane engines, for example, or smartphones. So a lot of times, if your country gets the foreign direct investments in terms of these high-tech products, you can classify that country as some kind of a point of production where this high-value addition occurred or high-value production occurred. But if your country is, for example, at some point an important textile producer or low-tech producer in terms of global commodity chains, you can say your share from this global transnational production will be lesser compared to these places where this high value addition occurred. So most of the time, competition among countries, especially today against China and other parts of Southeast Asia, you can see this competition in Asia very clearly. They generally try to get this much larger portion of this high value production processes, because most of the time, even Africa and most of the least developed countries, they're experts in low value added production like agriculture, textiles, or food processing. But that wouldn't bring too much money to your country or to those localities. So you can see, and among localities and among nation states, there is a competition to attract this high value added production. That is another important issue. Another issue is process of profit repatriation for these transnational corporations. For example, when these transnational corporations repatriate these profits or take them from local areas or another country and repatriate them to their homeland. For example, if it is an American corporation and let's say if it is produce something in China, it is overall profits in China, for example, can be transferred to the United States or some kind of offshore centers. That will be a profit repatriation. And under today's global economy, under normal conditions, most countries are open to this idea of profit repatriation, because if you limit this profit repatriation, these huge transnational corporations, when they bargain with your nation state, for example, they can use it as some kind of a threat if you limit their profit repatriation, because they are the much more powerful side and you are actually on the demand side for attracting this foreign direct investment, because you need, for example, more jobs and more employment. So investment will come from these transnational corporations. But if you cannot extract, if these transnational corporations couldn't extract all their profits from your country, and if there are limits to the profit repatriation, it will affect the nature of foreign direct investment. And another issue is the industrial competition of these transnational corporations when they bring this foreign direct investment to your country. They generally, most of the time, bring new competition, and they are much more advantageous in terms of their resources. And when they bring this industrial competition to your country, most of the time, for example, local competitors or local production will negatively affect from this power of transnational corporations. And they can, for example, react or create opposition in your own country for this industrial competition. Some people or some scholars, for example, argue that this new kind of industrial competition from foreigners can be advantageous for the local producers because they learn how to compete in worldwide markets. But for some scholars, they argue that this kind of huge multinational corporations and this oligopolistic market competition under their power was not very comfortable or very attractive or a very positive thing for the local producers, because they also somewhat limit the competition itself by changing the conditions of the work rules and the conditions of the workplaces when they bring this foreign investment. For example, when you have to compete with a very high technology company, for example, your local firms can easily get defeated and either default or get into a bankruptcy when they lose this competition. For example, after a certain point, when these foreign corporations, if they decided to leave your country, your local production already ended because they lost the competition. So some people argue that because of these kind of pressures on local producers, this industrial competition from transnational corporations can be very negative to the local producers. So you can be, as a nation state, very careful in terms of regulating this foreign direct competition. When we look at this state-firm relations, as you know, from the last week, we have only in this Zoom applications, we have only 40 minutes for this kind of extended class discussions. So we will have to stop after 40 minutes. So it is in our last 5 minutes. So I tried to summarize some other last points. So if we look at the state-firm relations, we can say clearly we see changing attitudes from states since 1980s. Especially the acceptance of neoliberal idea and free market and free trade principles is very important, this state-firm relations. So most of the third world, when they accept this IMF and World Bank structural adjustment policies, they also accept the liberal principles or trade liberalization. So when in 1970s, when you look at the third world or developing countries, you can see a lot of opposition movements or political opposition to this free trade or free market ideas or to foreign competition or the foreign investments in those countries. But after the 1980s, you can say this, after the acceptance of IMF, World Bank structural adjustment policies and widespread hegemony of this neoliberal idea, you can say states are much more flexible and they accepted most of the conditions of these transnational corporations. They bargain much more flexibly, and you can say they are not that adamant or negative towards the foreign direct investment. Instead, actually, they're trying to bring this foreign direct investment into their countries, and they are much more open to foreigners because of this need for new capital investments. For example, one of the reasons for this is the debt crisis in the 1980s in the third world. For example, this is another important issue. In the late 1970s, with the 1982 Mexican default and most of the underdeveloped world, when they get into debt repayment crisis in the 1980s, they only have one alternative, these Western financial institutions and Western multinational corporations for borrowing and loans and investment. So debt crisis in the 1980s were very crucial turning points for these countries to adjust themselves to this neoliberal world order. Actually, Reagan in the United States and the Thatcher in Britain, for example, were very important actors for a lot of world politicians to accept this neoliberal paradigm or Washington consensus in their explanation, in their, for example, economic and social policies. So you can say it's a tectonic shift occurred from late 1970s to early 1980s in terms of how especially third world countries and nationalistic elites perceive this foreign direct investments and other kind of issues. Okay, I think we reached to the end of the session in terms of this 40 minutes. So as I said, if you have further questions or any questions regarding these online sessions, I try to record them to the my YouTube channel too, but at the end, If there's no questions, see you next Wednesday. We will continue from where we left. I think we will get into the chapter 8, I think. Okay. See you later, guys.